So, what I've titled this is Restarting Our Church Services for Our Prayer Meeting. And I'm going to start off by, let's see here. First of all, what happened? We had earlier this year a thing called a coronavirus that they called COVID-19, made its way through the world and in the United States. A lot of people got ill. A lot of people have died. Hospitals, especially in urban areas, sometimes would get overwhelmed. And so governments worldwide started enforcing or whatever a stay-at-home regulations. And the purpose of those regulations was to not keep, the purpose was not to keep people from getting sick. That's impossible. People are going to get sick. The purpose was to try to slow the spread of the virus so that healthcare facilities would be able to provide care with everybody. In the United States, the federal government provided guidelines and protocols, but they left the practical side of things up to the states, each state. So each state has done different things. You watch the news. I don't want to overload you with that kind of stuff right now. On March 15, we voluntarily suspended our church services. Since then, the state of Ohio has enacted some orders and guidelines, but they never shut churches down, and we're thankful for that. The intended aim of all this was to slow the spread, and that is happening, and we're thankful for that. It's still going on, as has been mentioned, but we're thankful that things seem to be slowing down a bit. The federal government has provided some guidelines and protocols. They've got a whole website for it now. It's called Opening Up America Again, and I have a web link that you can go to if you want to check that out. Non-essential businesses are reopening. Men are finally getting haircuts, and so we're all excited about that, aren't we? When this started, there were several concerns I had. I'd like to share some of those with you. And frankly, none of the concerns I had involved physical death. Because with Christians, we know that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. But here are some concerns I had. One was an attitudes toward the virus. And these range the spectrum from one end to the other. One end of attitude toward the virus I was concerned about was people are going to really freak out. We're all going to die. It's just a matter of time. Another end of the spectrum with the virus was, well, I haven't gotten it yet. People are making too big a deal out of it. And so there's a spectrum there. Another was attitude towards the government. This is one of the benefits of being 50 years old is you learn history and you get to see how things go. And I thought, well, there's going to be some different attitudes towards the government with regards to this. Some are going to say the government's not doing enough, and others are going to say they're just being Nazis and communists. And a lot of this, again, depends on the sin natures of those in government. Thankfully, we don't live in communist China and other nations, and but I'm not going to dwell on that, okay? Another concern I had was coming closer to home that I am definitely concerned about and that I need to work about is disunity in our church body, attitudes towards one another. Disunity in our church body over these issues. And that can sadly make itself known in almost a disdain for others. Well, you feel this way, well, you're just, and vice versa. Thankfully, I have not really seen much of that, if any, in our church body, but I've definitely seen it in other Christians, and so it's a sad thing. One last concern I had, and this was especially one that was probably foremost in my mind when this all started 2.5 months or so ago, was the effect this would have on the spiritually immature, that some will fall away. Trials show where you're at. Trials test your faith. And if your faith is weak, that's gonna, it can have a really bad effect on you. If your walk with the Lord is weak, that will especially be seen and a poor attendance on church services. And if someone's attendance at church services, just the most basic thing for the Christian life is attending church services, if that was weak, this is going to have a potentially really negative influence. And so I've been praying for these, especially the last two things, that the Lord would protect us, and I really am thankful for how He has. So what do we need to do? This is where I wanted us to go today in 1 Peter. First, some background, the experience of the readers. They were suffering persecution because they were Christians. That's why they were suffering persecution. They lived after Rome was on fire and it burned down, and Nero was getting a lot of flack for it. And so Nero, he blamed the Christians for it, and that resulted in great persecution against Christians because of that false thing that was being said. So in 1 Peter, he urges Christians to be faithful to Christ in the fire of suffering. 1 Peter urges Christians to be faithful to Christ in the fire of suffering. And it encourages them that God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is sufficient to keep living godly lives even in times of persecution. And that has a real application to us. No matter what hardship you are going through, Christian, God's grace is sufficient to help you walk with the Lord in the hardest of times. Peter starts off in chapter 1 and the first half of chapter 2 of encouraging the believers by pointing them to their sure future. This is what keeps Christians grounded and also what keeps us going. Stopping and not doing anything is not God's will. We need to keep going, but we can't be tossed to and fro. And so the sure nature of our future is rooted in our salvation. We have in the first few verses of chapter 1, God's purpose of election. It's working out in our forgiveness of sins, our perseverance, and ultimately in the eternal inheritance. But yet believers were experiencing fiery trials. And so they needed to be holy as God is holy. They needed to have a reverence for the Lord. They needed to have a love for one another. This brings us then to chapter 2, verse 11, where there are definite obligations that Christians have because they're Christians. Believers who possess the salvation. There's some definite obligations. And so this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time tonight, chapter 2, verse 11, through chapter 5, verse 11. Yes, I am going to read these sections, and there's 14 obligations that Christians have. Let's go first of all, get my Bible here. Chapter 2, verses 11 to 12. And as I said, these will be online, but you can write them down too. Chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Peter says, "Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." So you got to live a holy life in public. A second one, verses 13 to 16, is submit to every ordinance. Verse 13, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God." Remember the context of this. These Christians were being persecuted by an official program led by Nero. And what did he say here? You need to submit to your authorities. It's not meaning be a doormat and disobey God. Those are qualifications, but overall, we need to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake. Number 3, just verse 17, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Number 4, servants have to submit to their masters. You're going to note this word submit comes up a lot in 1 Peter. Verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sin, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Number 5, wives have to submit to their husbands. There's that word again. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner in former times the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Husbands have to love their wives, number 6, verse 7. Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. It's always been a convicting part to me right there, that your prayers will not be hindered. Number 7, chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. We need to love one another. I'm just going to read verses 8 and 9 here. Finally, all of you be of one mind, have compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Number 8, we need to always do good, verses 13 to 17. Always do good. Verse 13. Who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Number 9, go to chapter 4. What Peter does in verses 18 to the end of the chapter is he gives an illustration of doing good. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Live for God's will and holiness, not your own sinful desires. Chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live for the rest of his time in the flesh, for the lusts of men, or for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these things, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. Number 10, you need to pray. Just verse 7. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. Number 11, love and serve one another. Verse 8. Above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Number 12, rejoice when suffering as a Christian and trusting the Lord. Verse 12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you're reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this manner. And I'm going to stop right there. And let's go to the next, look at verse 19. Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. Number 11, pastors need to faithfully shepherd the church. The elders who are among you, I exhort. I who am also a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, not as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. And then last, all must be humble and submissive. Verse 5. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you, be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Our humility and our submissiveness to the Lord, that is how we resist Satan, and that is how God is glorified. It's sad that too often we hunt for exceptions. Well, yeah, I know it says that, but what about this situation? What about that situation? We hunt for the exception and we put all our effort into that instead of just humbly obeying God's commands. Our submission, Peter says several times in this book, our submission needs to be the same kind and quality as Jesus. So I had to ask myself as I worked through First Peter several times, is Jesus' attitude, is his humility and his submission, do I have that same attitude? Are my words that way? Are my feelings toward people that way? Would Jesus have said what I just said, or typed, or posted? Um, it, would he have had the same? Would he have done the same thing I did? Good questions to ask. But remember that what they were going through was far worse than anything we have or probably will ever experience. So how do we go forward? How do we go forward? Just kind of summarizing what we learned from First Peter. 8 things here. How do we go forward? We need to be humble and submissive to God. We must be humble and submissive to God. We need to obey God and entrust our souls to Him. We need to be holy as God is holy. We must honor and obey our governing authorities. We must love and serve one another. We have to pray and praise and preach Christ. We must bless, not criticize or revile. And last, if we're going to suffer, we have to suffer for doing what's right and doing what's good, not for being evildoers. These are some great things here, about 8 points, just to have these before us, and we will please the Lord regardless of what happens. So when we talk about resuming our church services, I'm going to share some things here, and I trust they're scriptural, so that we're loving the Lord and one another and our neighbor, and we're honoring our governing authorities. There's all kinds of different views about this sort of thing. And those different opinions might even be possible in various church bodies. I know they are, as I've said. Because of that, no matter what might be proposed, not everybody's going to be pleased or happy with it. Not everybody's going to be happy about it. And so we need to have a spirit-controlled attitude toward one another. Let me also be clear. When we start our services up soon here, if you're not comfortable with attending because of health or whatever, that is absolutely okay. We're going to record the services. We'll upload them to YouTube. But let me also say on the opposite end, maybe you're the kind of person that you just can't wait to give me a big hug and a kiss on the cheek. Qualification there on the cheek, okay? You can't do that. We need to restrict our desires so that we're being careful and we're perhaps not offending others. Let me also remind you, this is just a temporary thing. This is not permanent. This is just temporary. Soon it'll be a memory in our past. So talk about resuming our church services locations. Hopefully the Windsor Community Center will be open soon. They have not told me that it's open yet, but I'm trying to communicate with them and just relay to them how we would do church and how we would have our services. Until then, if weather permitting, we'll meet right here, as what you can see here on our church property. And when we have services in our church property, there's going to be 2 things, and these will be in emails, okay, every time. You're going to need to bring your own chair, and you're going to need to bring a hymnal. We're not going to provide hymnals. If you don't have one of our hymnals, part of my effort this next week here, these next few days, will be communicating with you about that. I'll make sure you have a hymnal, all right, so that you have that. If it's raining, if it's cold, and we're not able to meet on our church property, we'll meet in a garage, we'll meet in a barn, but the same thing is going to be true. You're going to need to bring your own chair. You're going to need to bring a hymnal. So with regards to resuming our church services, there's some specific practices we need to keep, we're going to have to do. The first is with regards to the meeting place, some specifics here. If we're meeting in a garage or barn, I'm going to have to get an RSVP from you so that we can plan seating. Don't worry, I'll contact you. You don't have to worry about getting a hold of me. I will get in contact with you. Most likely Thursday or Friday of a week. Okay, as long as we're still not able to meet in the Windsor Community Center, I'll communicate with you if you're able to come to church. If we're in a meeting, a barn or a garage, we're going to have a separate entrance. We'll have a separate exit. I also forgot to mention these protocols and guidelines and practices. I've gleaned these from several sources. As I said, the White House has some protocols there, the Center for Disease Control, and I have links that you can click on if you want, and the state of Ohio has specifics there. I've looked at, I don't know how many churches, I don't know how many articles I've read. This has been the bulk of my reading these last months, and just trying to keep up with how can we and how should we have our services. And this is one of the things there, is just having a separate entrance and exit. Number 3, we'll probably, if we have to have a doors closed, we'll probably have one individual who will be opening that and closing that, so not everybody's touching the doorknob. More than likely, we won't have bathrooms available, just because if we're by somebody's home, that's just the best thing to do there. Maybe we can get a porta potty at the church property. It'll depend on how long we have to be there. Any materials will be self-serve. What I mean by that is like bulletins. They'll be on a table with a rock holding it down so the wind doesn't blow it away. Seating has to maintain social distancing by home units. Okay, so you don't have to be 6 feet away from each other. So what this means is my family does not have to be Trish 6 feet from Josiah, 6 feet from Lydia. Family units can stay together, but there has to be 6 feet between each family unit there. So again, these will be available on the website, and I'll email these out as well. And when we're done with our service, everybody will be dismissed by units. So you're not just all going out on your own, all at the same time, but we'll have each family unit dismissed at that time. There's going to be some individual responsibilities that you're going to have to make sure that you follow. One is that they are recommending that the elderly and at risk are advised to stay at home until early June. The White House has laid out, and the CDC has laid out, a 3-phase plan for reopening America. Phase 1 started about 2 weeks ago, and so some churches have already started several weeks ago. Phase 2 we're kind of in right now, and they have various determining factors. And how can a state know if it's, or a region know if it's in phase 1 or 2? We are definitely in phase 2, and so we're actually coming near the end of phase 2, or coming into phase 2, pardon me. And then in both those phases, phase 1 and phase 2, the recommendation is that those who are elderly and those who are at risk, they should just continue to shelter at home. That's a recommendation. It is not a law. Okay, I'll be clear on that. It's a recommendation. It's not a law. So stage 3, phase 3, that's when they say those who are elderly and those who are at risk. When we're at phase 3, the protocols are in place and things are definitely improving. That's when elderly and at risk don't have to stay at home anymore. That said, I've seen a lot of elderly people out and about. That's their choice. They can choose to do that. Nobody's holding a gun to them saying that they can't do that. So I'm just following along with that, making this clear. This is what the recommendation is. Number 2, we got to follow it. If you're sick, you need to stay home. If you're sick, you need to stay home. If you're going to cough, you're going to sneeze, use a Kleenex, go in the crook of your arm. Number 4, no handshaking or hugs. This is in our church services, okay? We need to maintain that 6 feet distance between non-related individuals. Wave, give a virtual hug, blow a kiss, but make sure none of the germs fly out, okay, at people. And I know we're all going to be wanting to do that right now, okay? Please don't. Not at our church services. I can't control it. If you go over to their house right now and you want to give each other a hug, I can't control it on that, okay? But we need to follow these protocols here. We'll have hand sanitizer, and if we're in a building, you can use that. That'll be supplied. You can wear a cloth face covering, but you don't have to, right? Nobody will think less of you if you do. Nobody will think less of you if you don't. Hopefully that is not going to be a problem for us as a church. All right. And then lastly, don't have close fellowship. My face here. Don't have close fellowship in a parking lot. So when we conclude the service and we exit, don't say, okay, now we're out and now we can get close. Please don't. Okay. I know we want to and we're dying to. Please don't. Not in our church service, especially when we're out in public like this. Just for the sake of the testimony and for our one another's safety along that line and following these protocols. Okay. Remember, this is temporary. We can forget that sometimes, can't we? This is temporary. It's just for a little bit of time. We want it now. Take our time, be patient, and follow the Lord, and it's going to be fine. It's really going to be fine, and it's going to be great. Some reminders here: be humble and submissive to God. Obey God and entrust our souls to Him. Be holy as God is holy. Honor and obey our governing authorities. Love and serve one another. Pray, praise, and preach Christ. We need to bless, not criticize or revile. And if we suffer, we should be suffering for what's good, not for what is evil.